philanthropists. The two-day conference, the Ideas Summit, features an impressive lineup of speakers, including Vice President Mike Pence, Senator Tom Cotton, Megyn Kelly, Bjorn Lomborg, Ian Rowe, Douglas Murray, Alan Gelzo, Rich Lowry, and your favorite NR writers. We hope you will consider joining us for this event. Please go to nrinstitute.org for more details and to register. Today's virtual event features a discussion between National Review editor Ramesh Ponnuru and Klon Kitchen on his recent piece for NR entitled Tech Warfare with Chinese Characteristics. This article was made possible by an NRI initiative to fund investigative journalism, long-form journalism in National Review, thanks to the generous supporters of National Review Institute. Klon Kitchen is a senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on the intersection of national security and defense technologies and innovation. Prior to AEI, he served as the director of the Heritage Foundation's Center for Technology Policy. And before that, he was a national security advisor to Senator Ben Sasse. His areas of expertise include cybersecurity and counterterrorism. And Ramesh Ponnuru is editor of National Review, where he previously covered national politics and policy for more than 25 years. Like Klon, Ramesh is also a senior fellow at AEI. Ramesh will be leading our conversation and taking your questions in the chat box, so you can start queuing them up. And now I will turn it over to Ramesh.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. And thank you, Klon, both for being here with us today. And also, let me thank you face-to-face, as it were, and here I will unmute myself and start all over. Excuse me. Thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction. And thank you, Klon, both for being here and for contributing that important article to our December 19th issue about Chinese tech warfare. I'm going to go into that article with you, but I would like to start off by talking about some developments that have happened since it appeared. Obviously, this topic of Chinese technology and surveillance of Americans and economic and military competition with Americans has gotten a little more high profile even than when you ran that article. What do you make of the balloons? What does that tell us about how China is conducting its end of this conflict and how we are?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, Ramesh, you're right. The volume on this conversation has certainly turned up. And for someone such as myself who's engaged on these issues for quite some time, it's welcome, to be perfectly honest with you. One of the aspects of my biography that we didn't mention is I spent 15 years in the U.S. intelligence community. And so I think about these issues from that perspective. So when you ask, what is my take on, the balloon that we shot down off the coast? One, no one should be surprised. States spy on each other. This is something that is part and parcel to the international system. This is what nation states do. But at the same time, that is not to say that that it's not important and that there aren't things that we ought to be doing in response. So in one hand, I would say, look, I'm not mad at China playing the game. I get frustrated when I feel like we're letting them win, right? Two, there are moral and categorical differences between what they do and what we do, both in terms of how we do it and also for what purposes. We practice espionage at every level against the PRC, but that is not under the direct motivation of doing harm to the people of China. In fact, we often are at great pains to make distinctions between the people of China and their communist government. The same cannot be said about the Communist Party in China. They specifically seek to do harm to American national interests, to constrain our economic, social, and political thriving. They seek to steal intellectual property and wealth. And that is one of the kind of key themes in the piece that I wrote for you, in terms of that has characterized China's chosen course of action now for generations. And that it's essential for understanding that reality and kind of its historical roots, for interpreting modern events like what we just went through. Now, in terms of the balloon, let's draw a distinction between the kind of the big balloon that we shot down off the coast versus these other unidentified things that we're knocking out of the sky right now. My impression is that the large balloon that was shot down is part of a ongoing systematic surveillance effort that China has been doing. I suspect that there was some type of a mistake that brought that balloon lower in altitude, that raised awareness and allowed us to engage it in a way that we have not engaged other times. And so that's one thing. And that probably caused, if you listen to the Department of Defense, in the wake of that event, we've kind of turned the dials on some of our radar and other aerial surveillance capabilities, and we're now identifying and engaging other capabilities. Now, the administration, for reasons that frankly I don't understand, has sought to communicate in a very confused manner about all of these things. And that is either because, one, they genuinely don't know what's going on, which is, frightening in and of itself, or there are such sensitivities associated with what we know and how we know it, that it's actually preferable to have this kind of public confusion. Neither of those is particularly good outcomes. And I'll kind of end my commentary this way and just say, there is a category in my mind, as a former intel guy, there's a category in my mind where you don't share everything you know, where the American people are just going to have to be content with not knowing all the details. But even in those circumstances, there's a way to communicate that brings a sense of kind of calm and, hey, we understand what this is. There's no massive threat that the American public need to be worried about, and the U.S. government is on this. And secrets or not, the Biden administration has failed to communicate even that baseline level of competence.
Well, it may just not have that baseline level of competence to communicate. In their defense, was that? I don't know. We could go, there are quite a few follow-up questions about the balloon that I'd like to ask, but I have a feeling it could eat up all of our time. I want to then instead turn to something else that's happened since your article appeared, and that is the creation and beginning of the staffing of a select committee on China, which will tackle the large set of issues that you talked about, and also some others. And I just want to know sort of what you take away from that. I know that you've got the same high opinion of the chairman, Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin, that I do, and a lot of us at National Review do. But how much of a difference do you think this committee can make?
I'm optimistic. I'm not Pollyannish about it. We're still going to have the normal Washington kind of politics around this. But I will say that even going back into the Trump administration, the China challenge was one of the very few, if not the only, truly bipartisan policy issues, and that has endured into the Biden administration. As you say, I think Chairman Gallagher is a serious person. I think he expresses simultaneously the requisite urgency on this issue, while also an appropriate level of optimism and not over alarmism. I think the ranking Democratic member is also shown to be a serious person. He and Gallagher have co-authored at least one piece of legislation going against the Chinese social media company TikTok.
Raja Krishnamurthy, correct?
Exactly. Yes. Sorry. Yes, that's right. And both of them have now consistently expressed what I interpret to be a sincere desire to keep this committee as bipartisan as possible, to go after issues in a way that is bipartisan, that is serious, that is informed by the technical merits of each of the questions. And then, so as I understand it, the goal is to use the committee largely to grow political and public awareness on what is being identified as the key issues as regards U.S.-China competition, and then to proactively work with other committees of jurisdiction to then build legislative proposals to improve the American posture. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a great way to do it. I think that's a good way to build consensus and also get other people with skin in the game involved. And it won't be, we're going into a presidential season, so there's no way this survives political contact, but you've got the right people doing the right thing. And so there's no reason not to be optimistic right now.
So turning to the article, one thing I'm kind of interested in is a little historical section of that article, where you suggest that the way that the Chinese regime approaches its competition with the U.S. and its surveillance and its approach to technology is it's not just about the ideology and interests of the Chinese Communist Party, but it reflects really the 19th century historical experience of China and its opening to the West. I wondered if you could say a few words about that.
Sure, and this isn't particularly unique to China. It's just that it specifically characterizes China, and that is that on multiple occasions throughout China's history in the early 19th century, they were engaged in military conflicts that demonstrated time and time again that they were not technologically sufficiently advanced to protect themselves and to advance their interests. And after each one of these occasions, they turned to outside sources, the United States, the Soviet Union, to help build more robust domestic innovation capability, just recognizing that that was going to be the key to their economic, social, and political future. That's rational. That's not strange or even malevolent. That was a rational way to go about doing things. So in the early 19th century, they turned to the United States, and initially the United States was actually quite receptive. And we started building bilateral agreements and trade partnerships, and we deliberately engaged in a type of technology transfer and innovation, and that started to work itself out. Then that kind of cooled. On the Chinese side, they were concerned about the westernization of their people, and on the U.S. side, there was concern about the import of Chinese workers into the United States and what that was meaning. And so that bilateral cooperation kind of went to the side. Then later on, when Mao took power and established his CCP government, he adopted a doctrine of, I think he called it leaning to one side, where he deliberately aligned China's future with the Soviet Union in the context of the Cold War. And for quite some time, that was to their benefit. It helped on a whole host of technological developments, including China's nuclear program. But then as Mao and the Soviet leaders, Mao was a big personality, to say the least. He was an evil man, to put it bluntly. But he didn't play nicely with others, and that included his kind of Soviet benefactors. And so that relationship soured. And then he began to enact, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which were essentially internal cancers to any type of real, meaningful innovation base, because it was much more important for government-aligned scientists to report that everything was going well, because anything less than that could result in your death, which meant that the truth very rarely was kind of rising up to the level of Mao. And there's a rule in all of human history that individuals can apply, and certainly despots should apply, is that if you don't allow people to tell you hard things, pretty soon they'll stop. And that is precisely what happened with Mao, and that arrested China's ability for a long time to do the type of innovation that it has long recognized is essential for its national thriving.
The Mao era ended,
Yeah,
of course, and in some ways, I think you'd have to say the regime's made up for lost time.
yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's important now. So to bring all this into the modern context, if I can, I'll kind of set the stage a little bit. So I think there's a dynamic that's equally true for all nations, and that is that perhaps more now than ever, some will argue with me on that, but for the sake of this conversation, perhaps now more than ever, emerging technologies are at the beating heart of the future of societies and economies and battlefields. And the overwhelming energy on the development of those technologies, as we think about artificial intelligence or robotics or quantum or a whole host of other activities, the overwhelming energy on all of that is in the private sector. And what that is translating to is that the US government is no longer the national security stakeholder, it is a national security stakeholder, and it is increasingly sharing its national security responsibilities and burdens with industry. Now, for a long time, the government really struggled to recognize and reconcile itself with that reality, as did industry. Industry saw that largely as a complicating factor for business, and they tried to resist the responsibilities that came with its growing influence. Nevertheless, I think over the last 5 years, particularly, there's been a general recognition of this shared responsibility and shared burden. So I think that's true across nations. Now, there are two models of responding to that reality, one typified by the United States and one typified by China. In the United States, the ultimate effort is government and industry are trying to find cooperative ways based not on coercion, but on mutual interests and of love of country, ideally, to find ways to share the national security burden in fair and constitutional ways. And that's messy, and it can feel really, annoying and slow, but it is ugly and messy as it can be. It's more enduring as you work through it. And that's, I think, the benefit of the US model. China, looking at the same dynamics that I was describing earlier, has chosen to go a different way. So instead of engaging its industrial base, its technological industrial base as partners, it simply co-opted them. And it now leverages its technology industry as an extension of the state. They don't get a choice. They've passed multiple laws, national security laws and cybersecurity laws, that require the full cooperation and even the industry to lie about the full cooperation with their government. And they are now using that quite effectively to steal intellectual property, to steal US persons' data, and to conduct a whole host of government and corporate espionage activities that are meaningful. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. You report at one point in the article that 1 in 5 North American companies say that they've had their data stolen. I assume that's from some kind of authoritative survey. But I was just wondering, is that North American companies doing business in China or just all North American companies?
That's North American companies, period.
And so presumably that means that there are others who've had their data stolen, but are not aware of it.
Oh, yes. No, that's exactly right. No, I mean, so if you listen to FBI Director Christopher Wray, he has said multiple times in public speeches that China is stealing almost immeasurable levels of U.S. Intellectual property and wealth, and that the Chinese effort is larger than all of our other competitors combined. So he's now said that in public testimony. He said that in public speeches. He's clearly kind of ringing a clarion bell there that this problem is massive in both scale and in terms of overall volume.
So Christopher Wray also says, as you note again in this National Review article, that if you are an American adult, the Chinese regime probably has personal data of yours. So what are they going to do with my data or your data? I mean, of course, you as somebody involved in this sphere and who's been in the intelligence community might be that they do different things with your data than they do with mine.
Yeah. This is the right question for a lot of Americans, because we'll have this conversation about TikTok and IP theft and that kind of thing, and they kind of like, well, I mean, like, I don't prefer that, but ultimately, what do I really am concerned about?
If they know that I went to Starbucks yesterday, what difference does it make?
Yeah. Okay. So let me start with some of the scarier front end stuff, and then I'll back up and give you bigger categories for how this type of information is used. One, I think it's helpful for individual Americans to understand that it's about more than just you, or it's about more than just me. So let's use TikTok as an example. So more than a third of the U.S. population is an active user of TikTok, which is a Chinese-owned social media company. Not only does that app collects the kinds of things that most social media companies collect, your contacts, your GPS location, your online activities, but it also collects things like, if you look at the terms of service, it explicitly says that it captures your keyboard swipes and patterns. It collects your out of app activities on your phone. So even when you don't have TikTok open as an app, it's not only collecting the information that you generate while using their app, it's collecting information that is generated in other apps. Now, how can that be used? Well, obviously that can be used to target individual Americans. So, people like me, who were or are part of the government, that kind of thing can be used for blackmail or just for tracking, a whole host of things. But beyond that, if you are the Chinese Communist
Party,
to any
Chinese officials listening in here, I just want to make it clear: Klon is unblackmailable.
That's right.
Is above board, but please go on.
Pristine. I am. Yeah. No, but for example, if you're the Chinese Communist Party and you have a desire to manipulate or move the American populace, well, if you understand the news consumption habits of a third of the population, and if you understand which narratives and which visuals garner the greatest engagement from that third of the population, that is an incredibly powerful tool that can be leveraged for political ends. If you want to constrain the U.S. government and its ability to build and leverage political will within its own population, something like TikTok is hugely valuable. And we've actually seen the Chinese government do this before. So there in Taiwan, there is a social media and communications app called Line, Line. And I think 2 or 3 years ago, the Chinese government was shown not only to be listening in and watching the activity of that social media network, but they had actually manipulated it to such a degree that they were able to engineer the election of a pro-Beijing governor in a district that is historically anti-China. And there are occasions like that have happened time and time again. And if the American people are concerned about being manipulated by politicians and big tech, the real concern ought to be the CCP's leveraging of technology to move our population. So I could talk in more detail about all that, but the point is that this is about more than individual users, and it's certainly about more than TikTok dance videos.
So I don't really understand. Is there a serious argument against banning TikTok? Why don't we just say, look, if you want to do your cringeworthy dances, do it somewhere else, but not at something that has this degree of Chinese communist infiltration and control?
Yeah, so it's from an evidentiary-based standpoint, I think we're there. I mean, TikTok has come up with a proposal for mitigating national security concerns. I've looked at that in detail. They're presenting it on the Hill. It's not gaining any traction whatsoever. The CEO of TikTok is going to be before the House Energy and Commerce Committee in March. That's going to be a bloodletting. It's just not going to go well because it doesn't matter how slick he is and how impressive he is. They just simply do not have a good story to tell. And there's been enough public reporting about how Chinese officials have used that information even to target journalists. There's just not a good story there. So we're no longer at the point where we're having to make the case. I think that case has largely been made. I think the resistance has largely been, from a political standpoint, a lot of politicians understand that if we take that final step, if TikTok is banned, the same underlying rationale is going to apply to a large group of Chinese companies, Chinese tech companies particularly. And the economic impact of kind of systematically removing those companies would be significant. There's no doubt about that. And so
are there other companies that are sort of household names in the sense, that are as high profile, that just maybe don't have the same notoriety as TikTok does? Are there other companies we should be aware of?
Sure. So, I mean, if you watch the Super Bowl, there was an ad for a Chinese e-commerce company. Their name is slipping me. It'll come to me in a second. But I mean, they had a full-blown Super Bowl ad, and they're obviously making a huge play to be in the United States. You take someone like Alibaba. Alibaba is essentially Amazon and eBay and Google all rolled into one. And for a long time here in DC, they were one of the main sponsors of Cap Center, right? So there's a host. The most popular civilian drone or commercial drone manufacturer is a company called DJI. They are a Chinese company. They own 70%, or I guess it's between 50 and 70% now, of the global market and nearly 70% of the US market. If you think about a company who makes smart devices, the global dominator of that industry and the US dominator of that industry is a Chinese company called Tuya. Before we took action against Huawei, they were on the verge of becoming the dominant 5G telecommunications network provider in the United States. I mean, the list goes on, and that's because for a long time, Chinese technology providers were the most efficient. They provided good services, and they were cheap. And it turns out that the reason they were cheap is because they are heavily subsidized by the Chinese government. So it's not even a matter of US companies being able to compete with them on an even scale. And that was done because, precisely going back to that worldview that I described earlier, the Chinese government said, we will subsidize these companies so that they can gain greater market share because they're ultimately going to operate as extensions of the state.
So when you were talking about those companies being cheaper and better, you used the past tense. Has that changed?
Well, it's changing. So the United States has woken up to this challenge and is beginning to engage it seriously. It's a hard challenge, so I don't pretend that it's easy. I think it's easy to understand. It's difficult to engage. And I think that's where we are. We're trying to find, and we have to understand too that not every industry is the same. So, e-commerce is not cloud, and 5G is not, clothing, or whatever. And so it's a matter of trying to have some type of a systematic, prioritized effort against the most pressing threats, while understanding too that there's not a whole lot of good alternatives sometimes. So if you're a U.S. company, and for the last 40 years you have built a just-in-time supply chain that's maximized efficiency and allowed us to have great, cheap products. And even if you see the writing on the wall and realize you're going to have to diversify away from China, there's no turnkey alternative anywhere else in the world, even in India. That's all having to be built right now. And so it is hard, and I'm empathetic with those concerns. Nevertheless, difficulty cannot become an excuse for inaction.
So I hope all of our viewers and listeners are finding this conversation as fascinating and sobering as I am. I just would like to remind you that if you have questions, please put them into the chat box, and after I'm done monopolizing, I'll ask some of those questions to Klon. I was hoping, Klon, that we could look at this a little bit from the other end in terms of the importance of all of this, technology theft and espionage and surveillance to the Chinese economy. Is it possible to get a kind of rough sense of sort of, what proportion of Chinese patent filings are based on espionage, for example, directly or indirectly?
So yeah, one of the hardest things about a large portion of Chinese technological innovation is predicated on IP and data that they have stolen from the West. That's undoubtedly true. I mean, oftentimes many of the apps or services that they deploy are copies of US or Western offerings. But because of the nature of the regime and just unreliable metrics, it's hard to put meaningful assessments on portions and size, because on economic reporting, for example, the regime has a political interest in manipulating that reporting to fit whatever their political messaging is for the time. Suffice to say, while that continues to be the case, that they steal a lot of information and that a lot of their growth is predicated on Western information and technology, it is also the case now more than ever that China is innovating for real in its own right, that it has stolen enough to be able to actually innovate on its own. And I think TikTok is a great example. TikTok is a great example. There's not a US social media company that wouldn't give their left arm to get a hold of TikTok's AI algorithm, their recommendation algorithm. It is phenomenal. It engages its user community and has a dwell rate. People stay on that app longer and are more engaged than what typifies a US app. And that is a marker of genuine and legitimate innovation on China's part. And so in the past, we used to comfort ourselves by saying, well, they may be able to copy our stuff and they may be able to build clones of everything, but they can't actually innovate. And so they'll always be behind. I don't think that's a safe assumption any longer. Especially on kind of key priority targets. If we maintain our free market system, it is more likely to produce a variety and a more agile economy, no doubt about it. But on key areas of interest for the CCP, the Chinese have proven time and time again that they can truly innovate now, and that those innovations are able to gain large market share within the global economy.
So is the US conducting similar espionage in China? I mean, presumably we do espionage to get military secrets, but are we engaged at anything like the same level in economic espionage?
No, we don't do that. Legally, we cannot do that, but we also don't do it because even so, for example, let's say the NSA went in, somehow buried itself into ByteDance or TikTok. So TikTok, and then ByteDance is the Chinese company who owns TikTok, buried itself in ByteDance's servers, and we found the secret sauce of their recommendation algorithm. Well, who do we turn that to? The NSA, we don't have national champions. So the NSA isn't going to take that algorithm and then go make a decision that says, okay, well, we're going to give this to Facebook and not Google, or Microsoft and not someone else. Like, we don't do that. And it wouldn't help us if we did, frankly. That's not the way we operate. And we don't have a problem per se in just a straight up market competition. But the reality is that even if we gave the algorithm to a national champion, that doesn't change the underlying dynamic that is actually the decisive variable, and that is the CCP's their support, their economic support to their national champions. We're not going to do that. We can't do that, but they will. And so even if we have the better product, which we, I think often have, it's still not a fair fight. And so we don't do that. What we do is we do traditional espionage in support of American national security and not economic competition.
So are there ways we could go on offense, or should? I mean, given these deep differences in our systems and how they work?
Yeah. Well, so it begins, as I said earlier, with the government and industry coming to a common understanding of the challenge and of some type of voluntary agreement to move forward together. Now that's difficult for a lot of industry because a lot of them are heavily leveraged in China. But that realization, frankly, based more on what Chinese President Xi has done, and less than kind of how Washington has been engaging, but just Xi has made very clear his intentions and the fact that the window of opportunity to do meaningful, sustained business in China, that window's closing. And so people are beginning to make adjustments, and that's an essential first step in engaging them. The other thing the United States is doing is trying to slowly turn the economic and diplomatic screws on China to constrain their freedom of movement in the international system on these issues. So, for example, we're contesting their presence on international organizations and standard-setting boards. We're engaging them at the UN. I think we all have I certainly have my opinions about the UN, but it is nevertheless an environment in which countries engage, and so we are engaging them in ways that are seeking to limit their influence and constrain their ability to kind of shape that institution for their own ends, and then beginning to build new alliances that will ultimately support the realignment of supply chains, and particularly technological supply chains, in and amongst a trusted network of friends and partners, recognizing that Western democracies have an interest in building trusted supply chains within themselves, as China's supply chains become less reliable and ultimately less productive over the course of time.
So kind of a partnership across the Pacific, one might even say.
You could call it that. It seems like if we had some kind of a Trans-Pacific Partnership plan or something like that, that would be super helpful.
I've got a bunch more questions, but a lot of great ones are also coming in from our listeners. I'm just going to ask one last one before I start turning to theirs. And that is, a lot of the things you are talking about are places where China has been sort of increasingly menacing, taking a lead, and sort of gaining power. But you can look at other things that make the Chinese regime look pretty rickety, as though it may be about to, or maybe possibly in the beginning stages of, going into decline. And I wonder how you put those pieces together in your own mind.
Yeah, so our colleague at AEI, Hal Brand, is, I think, the most compelling prophet of this reality that rather than being an ascendant power that's 10 feet tall and bulletproof, that China is actually a peaked power and is already beginning its decline for both economic and demographic reasons. I think Hal makes a very compelling argument. I'm inclined to agree with him. But he also says, and I think this is important, that in the near term, this makes China more dangerous, not less. That if you look historically, declining powers, particularly autocratic powers that are in decline actually become more dangerous when they realize that their window of political opportunity is shrinking, that they become more aggressive, they become more reckless. And I think that's true. So if I were to describe my own feelings about this issue, I would simply say that I think over the long term, because of the growing awareness that the United States is demonstrating, and because I think we are going to be largely successful in building these new alliances the way that we ought, I feel really good about our ability to thrive over the next 20 to 30 to 40 to 50 years. I think, however, to get there, we have to navigate a fraught decade. I think the next 10 years really matter, and how we go about that is really going to be important.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a conversation I had a long time ago with the late James Lilly, who was one of George H.W. Bush's ambassadors to China, where he said, if in 1920 you had predicted 30 or 40 years from now, Germany will be a completely peaceful power that poses no threat to anybody and will have developed in a really positive direction, you would have been right. but there is that small matter of getting from here to there. And obviously we were talking about China at the time. Let me turn to some of the questions that are coming in here. Peter Flory asks about the administration's new export controls on semiconductor technologies. Do you think they got it about right? He adds that some have suggested that there's a risk that China could use these restrictions over time to rip off the Band-Aid of dependence on the US and allied technology and end up becoming more self-sufficient on the bleeding edge. What do you think of that idea?
I have to give the administration credit. I think the recent export controls on semiconductor and semiconductor talent were really good. Frankly, I think, and thus far the enforcement of those has been solid. So, for those who don't know, what the administration did was it said a couple of things. One, that we're not going to allow China to purchase certain semiconductors of a particular advanced technological state. Two, we're not going to allow. So the central role that the United States plays in the development of the semiconductor supply chain is in the design and the underlying tools for the design of semiconductors. The actual manufacturing or the fabrication is overwhelmingly done overseas, largely in Taiwan, also in South Korea, some in Japan. And so what we said was, not only are we not going to allow China to be able to purchase these semiconductors, but we're also not going to allow American ingenuity and intellectual IP for the tools and the designs of these advanced semiconductors to be used in anything given to China either. On top of that, no American or American citizen is allowed to work on any Chinese semiconductor manufacturing and fabrication. So that was, at that point, we literally had droves of experts who were working for the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, which is the world's kind of dominant semiconductor, or Intel, or any of these other companies that were in China. Their American staff had to pack up and leave right then and there, and that gutted. That was a true gut punch to the Chinese semiconductor capability. Okay, so there's that. But then the right question was asked. Well, does this hasten China's ability to kind of cut ties with Western technology? Well, look, we're in a situation where there is no silver bullet answer, and where there's always risk, no matter what course of action is chosen. That particular risk, I actually feel more comfortable with, because China is constrained by physics at this point. They simply have not been able to marshal the expertise or the equipment necessary to design and fabricate these kind of cutting edge semiconductors. Now, over the next 20 to 30 to 40 years, might that be the case? Certainly, it would be impossible to rule that out. But I think what we've actually done through the Biden administration's actions, and by limiting China's access to a particular type of machinery called extreme ultraviolet photolithography machine, which is a $1 billion machine that you have to make cutting edge semiconductors, and only one company in the entire planet can make them. It's a company called ASML, and we have told ASML, as the world's #1 consumer of semiconductors, you will not be selling that machine to China, period. And the Dutch have gotten on board, as have the Japanese here recently. So the risk is there. You can't say that it's not, but I think it's a managed risk. And in the kind of sweep of possible actions that we could take, I think the administration took about the right steps that they could.
I suppose it probably doesn't help the Chinese regime's ambitions that its scientists seem to be dying an awful lot lately.
That's right. It certainly doesn't help.
Another question, this from Heidi Poso. Forgive me, Heidi, if I am mispronouncing your last name. But this is something that's sort of come up in different ways during our conversation. Basically, what would you say to companies about doing business in China going forward?
Yeah, so thank you, Heidi. That's a great question, and this is something I actually do a fair bit of, and it's simply this: you're going to have to choose a flag, and it's important to understand that it's not the U.S. government that is forcing you to do that; it's the Chinese government. The Chinese government has chosen a course of action that requires companies, particularly foreign companies, to capitulate, and that capitulation has now gained a sufficient gravity to where the United States deems it a national security threat. Now, the United States has sought for more than 40 years to find a pathway where the Chinese, even the Chinese Communist Party, was able to participate in the international marketplace as a responsible actor and to thrive, and where we could work and trade alongside one another in ways that were mutually beneficial. But for reasons that are their own, they have chosen not to avail themselves of those opportunities. And now the risks have grown sufficiently large and acute where the United States government realizes it has to take a different course. And so that's what we're doing. It is understandable for companies to be frustrated by the disruption that comes from deteriorating relationship between Washington and Beijing. I get it, but frustration doesn't change any of the facts on the ground. And while I think a lot of companies consoled themselves with the idea that this would be too costly and too disruptive, there's no way that this could possibly happen, this kind of strategic decoupling, there's no way this could happen. I think many of those companies are now realizing that not only is it happening, but the speed at which it's happening is increasing. And so I often tell companies that now is the time to act while you still have agency in the conversation, because we're rapidly approaching a day where the relationship between Washington and Beijing deteriorates sufficiently to where your opinions and your interests simply won't matter. And now it's going to be an argument between two nation states, and you'll simply be caught in the middle.
William Marcy asks for you to comment on the principles of the 1998 book, Unrestricted Warfare, which, if my dim recollection is serving me, was produced by two officials in the People's Liberation Army. So was that something that's an important part of our story, or has a continuing influence?
Well, I think what books like that really help to illustrate is the Chinese model of a kind of whole of society approach to national interest and political engagement. So an example of what that means. So the Chinese government understands that any Chinese person, not just a Chinese citizen, but a person of Chinese ethnic origin, is one of their citizens, regardless of where they live and where they are physically present, and therefore have a duty to the Chinese state and to the Chinese people to pursue that nation's interests. Now, that doesn't mean that the individuals agree with that, but just to kind of set the stage for how the CCP thinks about these things. They think in whole of society.
And there have been some reports, which I personally found shocking and alarming, of Chinese government or its agents surveilling and harassing people of Chinese origin living in the United States, or often Chinese nationals living in the United States.
Yeah, some of the most recent reporting is how the Chinese government had set up Chinese police departments inside the United States for that express purpose of tracking and coercing Chinese, either Chinese citizens here in the United States or just ethnic Chinese, even American citizens. And the alarm flags have kind of gone up on that, and that's being confronted, and they're being kicked out. But that is indicative of how the CCP sees these things. So when we talk about books, I forgot the title of the book, but what those books are trying to illustrate is
Unrestricted
that
warfare.
Unrestricted warfare, and the modern notion of Chinese warfare is actually Chinese political warfare, and that means that there is a type of engagement that Beijing is engaged in across every spectrum of life, and they intend to win, and they intend to leverage their capacity as a society to advance those interests.
So, another question from Heidi that I should get to. This one's about CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, I believe. May have the acronym slightly wrong.
That's right.
She says there seems to be a shift in the type of companies or industries being acquired that need to go through the CFIUS review, and people are unclear about these requirements. What do you think the approach ought to be? Good question.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. So CFIUS has undergone. So for those who don't know, CFIUS is a government committee that is tasked specifically with reviewing foreign investments in the United States for any national security equities or concerns. Previously that was things like who owns the patent on our night vision and who can buy an F-16 and things like that, or certain jet engines from GE or some other company. But here over the last 6 years or so, that has expanded to review things like TikTok, for example. There's an active CFIUS investigation into TikTok, and I think we're going to continue to see reforms of CFIUS's authorities and structures to match this growing relevance of in this case the technology industry. I think we're going to see similar things when it comes to biotech here in the near future. So I think this is growing. But even with CFIUS, some of these things exceed the kind of the narrow mandate of CFIUS. It defines national security threats in very peculiar, and the government always does this, but very peculiar, discrete ways. And there are obviously larger political and socioeconomic threats that wouldn't meet that definition squarely, but that should still be considered. And so I think we're going to be in a place where the making of that particular kind of security sausage is going to go on for quite some time, and it's going to be messy. But that's in part due because we're constrained by constitutional norms, and we're trying to create something that will be long lasting, not just kind of sufficient in the moment.
Somebody named John Hillen has submitted a question. I'm kidding. He's one of our authors for our upcoming cover stories on U.S. and China, a topic that we obviously devote a great deal of attention to. But John is asking about big tech. People on the left and the right want to break up big tech. Is American big tech in some ways an advantage for the U.S., i.e. Google being our best bet to compete against CCP efforts in quantum computing? I know, Klon, you've thought a lot about some of these tech policy issues, so that's a great question. What do you think?
Yeah, John, I think that's right. So the standard caveat I always have to have here is there are very real, serious domestic, social, political concerns about the role of technology in society, the effect it's having on us as individuals and as a group, about the economic interplay of technology economies that tend to be winner take all, or at least they seem that way sometimes. And I don't give any of those conversations short shrift. I think they're incredibly important. I do, however, put them in a larger context. And I think this larger context should dictate and inform how we have those other conversations. And that is, simply put, and then, if the United States goes to war with China in the next 10 years, that's going to be a conventional fight. That's going to be ships and planes and bombs, and there'll be a cyber element, but it's going to be a traditional fight. And the United States government is recognizing that we're not even prepared for that. Ukraine is demonstrating that, right? So we're now at a place where morally the U.S. government has to make massive investments in conventional forces, just to be ready for the possibility of a fight in the next 10 years. Well, that's one budget. That's one particular way of budgeting. But beyond the next decade, in the 2 to 3 to 4 decade period, is when a lot of these emerging technologies are going to mature sufficiently to where they really do become decisive on those future battlefields. And so the United States cannot simply ignore those capabilities in the long term because it has to do this short-term conventional force buildup. But trying to do both of those, trying to invest and build both of those militaries simultaneously is essentially a recipe for failure on both accounts. And so that's the challenge. So where do I think we actually have an advantage, and where do I think that we will be able to outperform someone like China that's facing the same challenge? We have an industry, we have a technology industry that is agile and capable and can do the type of long-term innovation at scale that will be necessary for us in the 20 to 30 to 40 year time period, and who can be waiting there with the capabilities for us if the United States government can create a predictable and steady regulatory environment, if we can resist the seemingly siren call in today's politics of constantly using big tech as the opponent of choice that justifies essentially every political act of extracting revenge and getting your pound of flesh, regardless of, I think, fact base oftentimes. And so it asks us to be much more disciplined in our domestic political conversations about tech. Now, again, I don't think that big tech or any of these other companies are immune from responsibility or from political engagement. They are a participant, and they are not absolved from their responsibilities. I just think it's not too much to ask, particularly if we're at risk of cutting off our national security nose despite our political face. For us as individual citizens and as policymakers at the White House and on Capitol Hill, to think carefully about the words that we use and to be more deliberate in how we talk about these things.
So I think ending with a call for careful and rigorous thought of the kind that Klon has exemplified for all of us is a good note to end on. I'd like to thank you, Klon, for coming and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you all who have participated in this and listened to us. And thank you to the Institute for setting this up. And I know you'll be back for our next National Review Institute event. And we are certainly going to look forward to having Klon in our pages in the months to come as well.